Ethiopia frees Tigrayan rebel leaders to promote a national dialogue on ending the war. But government airstrikes continue to kill dozens. So, how genuine is the Prime Minister's offer of a peaceful solution? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Ethiopia's government appears to be offering an olive branch to end more than a year of conflict in the northern Tigray region. It's releasing several high-profile political prisoners as part of an amnesty for Orthodox Christmas. Those pardoned include leaders and founders of the rebel Tigray People's Liberation Front. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed says this will pave the way for a national dialogue for lasting peace. The UN and EU have welcomed their release, but some government critics called it a publicity stunt. Criticisms increased after the latest government airstrike killed at least 56 internally displaced people near the Eritrean border. Many children were wounded, according to aid workers. Ethiopia's government denies targeting civilians and blocking aid convoys. The war has created one of the worst humanitarian crises in the Horn of Africa. We'll begin our discussion in a moment. First, let's bring you up to speed on the latest developments. The Ethiopian government has been making steady territorial gains in recent weeks, most notably a string of towns and villages, including a UNESCO heritage sites in Lalibela. Last month, the leader of the TPLF wrote to the UN Secretary General. He announced his fighters would withdraw from the neighboring regions of Amhara and Afar as a condition of possible peace talks. The UN Human Rights Council is investigating allegations of widespread rights abuse, including illegal detention, torture, and sexual abuse. And there's been growing international pressure on Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed to end the fighting. The outgoing U.S. envoy met Abe on Friday, shortly before the pardons were announced. All right, let's bring in our guests in London. Awol Allo, senior lecturer in law at Keele University. In Oslo, Kjetil Tronvoll, professor of peace and conflict studies at Oslo New University College. And in The Hague, Adem Kassie Abebe, program officer at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Welcome to the program. We contacted ministers and spokespeople from the Ethiopian government, but they didn't respond to our interview requests. Adem, let me start with you today. This airstrike came just a day after the government announced that high-profile political prisoners would be pardoned and released. That was to include some leaders of the TPLF. What kind of message does it send to announce pardons and releases one day and then conduct an airstrike the day after?
Thank you very much for having me again. You're right, there has been reports of airstrikes and significant casualties. The government hasn't confirmed or denied it. But overall, I think the airstrikes, the several airstrikes that we've seen in the past couple of days are not going to deliver anything that a war of 14 months have not been able to deliver. And so it is really, in my opinion, not needed, not necessary, especially at a moment where there seems to be a real gesture of peace towards peace.
Well, let me ask you, under what conditions are these prisoners being released? First of all, do we know if they actually have been released yet? And once they are, or once they have been, will they have to be under house arrest? Will they be able to speak up or speak out? What are the conditions they might be faced with?
Thank you. So the Attorney General basically dropped the charges against these prisoners. So the prisoners have not been convicted. Their charges were dropped. The justification provided by the government is that this is an important and necessary step to expand the scope of the national dialogue process that the government is promising the Ethiopian people. So I saw this as a really important and positive step, not just because we have individuals who have not been imprisoned in the first place freed, but also because of this promise of a comprehensive national dialogue process that will help Ethiopia solve its long-standing political problem and lead to some kind of political settlement. But the problem, of course, is that you still have significant number of individuals in prison, including leaders of the Oromo Liberation Front, which is a major political party in the Oromia region. We have still an armed conflict ongoing, including the drone attacks you just mentioned, a major humanitarian crisis, not just in Tigray. The situation in Tigray is unique, but in other regions as well, in Oromia, in Amhara, in the Afar region, you have a deepening polarization, which makes it very difficult for a national dialogue process to work. So primary responsibility lies with the government to create the conditions necessary for a credible, inclusive national dialogue process. But I think the steps that have been taken so far, the release of prisoners, is a good thing, and I think we should recognize it as such.
Kjetil, do we know at this point who has been released? Do we know more about these political prisoners who've been pardoned? And do any of them pose any kind of political danger to Abiy Ahmed going forward?
Yes, the list of names of the individuals released have been made public. And just need to add to Awol's explanation, Attorney General Gideon distinguished between two categories of released. The people belonging to the Oromo Federalist Congress and the Balderas were released due to help facilitate the political dialogue process moving forward. The prisoners belonging to the TPLF party were released due to their old age and health condition on a humanistic reasoning. So it is clear from the government side that they distinguish between the categories of prisoners released. And I think this is basically, as stressed, an indication of trying to facilitate a political dialogue in Ethiopia by including cherry-picking certain opposition parties they want to take part. Of course, the most significant ones are the release of Mohammed and Bekele Garba, the leadership of the Oromo Federalist Congress, which really pose a direct electoral threat to the current government. But this is not aimed at a peace negotiation process to the armed actors of TDF and OLA. And the government is sending out mixed signals in this regard. They are continuing their bombing, they're continuing the ground war, and they're continuing also very hostile rhetoric. If you read the recent couple of days statements by the Prime Minister's office. So we need to keep two topics in mind at the same time. Yes, it is positive that the government is aiming to, broaden the democratic civil space in the country. But the real problem is the civil war, which is wreaking havoc in the northern parts of Ethiopia and in west, in Oromia.
Adem, Kjetil there was talking about these mixed messages that he says are going on when it comes to the government. On the one hand, you have the release of these prisoners and you have talk of a dialogue. And then on the other hand, you have these airstrikes that have happened. Have we heard anything from the government about these airstrikes? Has there been any information shared by the government about them?
No, I certainly haven't seen any, but there is two kinds of reports. The first, indeed, is the aerial attacks that apparently have killed a lot of civilians as well. And there's a second part, which is that TPLF fighters are actually engaging in a counter-offensive in some parts of the border areas with Amhara, especially the Raya area. So there is a significant, indeed, trouble. There is still tension that is lying that can disrupt any progress towards peace. At the same time, I think these are important steps that have been taken. And we should also wait and see as the government then unveils a strategy towards peace. As Tronvoll said, there is a fundamental need for a peace process that then enables the success of the dialogue. So there is indeed mixed signals, but I think we haven't had any time really to process what has happened, and other measures would have to be unveiled. But I think there is a genuine indication of accepting that war is not going to solve the problems, that there has to be some kind of process, some kind of negotiation. But in terms of how exactly that will be designed, what will be the strategies, what will be the outcomes that the government seeks to see, that I think would take some time before it emerges. And we've also to remember that this is not an easy decision. It's a very, very difficult, very controversial decision. A lot of people have expressed their anger, their frustration for several reasons. One is, of course, the desire to see justice. There has been so much suffering since the war started, and actually even before that, that people want justice. People want to see somebody held accountable. So that is very important. And secondly, and I think perhaps more fundamentally, a lot of people have very little trust, very little confidence in the government. There is a critical mass, a critical segment of society that doesn't have confidence in the government. And so it's not just, these points of disagreement, these episodes of disagreement are an indication of a fundamental problem of lack of confidence, partly because, especially after the June invasion, the TPLF invasion of Afar and Amhara regions, people felt they have been lied to, that they have been exposed to brutalities that they didn't imagine. Even as the government was telling them that they had a strategy, that nothing of an invasion or anything would happen. And so the government would have to work really hard, one, to assure people that they will not be exposed to any danger, especially people in Amhara and Afar that are close to the fire. So I think there has to be significant assurance, and also taking serious measures towards peace to reduce the risk of a potential escalation of the conflict.
Awol, I'd like to ask you, from your vantage point, just how genuine is the Prime Minister's offer of a peaceful solution right now?
I think it is, in the face of the very brutal and traumatizing experience that Ethiopia had over the last year and a half, and significant transformation in the political landscape, primarily because of the decisions that the Prime Minister has taken, it is very difficult at this point to trust the Prime Minister and his government. I mean, a national dialogue process in a country like Ethiopia, with a contested, very complex history, with contrasting visions of the future, where major political actors disagree on the kind of country and the kind of people that they want to be going forward, it is very difficult to see how a national dialogue process that is not genuine, that's not credible, that is not inclusive, would help solve this country's problem. Now, the government's public position so far is that those who are engaged in an armed conflict will not be part of the national dialogue process, namely the Tigray Defense Forces or Oromo Liberation Army. These are groups with significant constituencies behind them. A national dialogue process that doesn't include these forces cannot be an inclusive national dialogue process. It cannot hope to solve Ethiopia's foundational, long-standing problem. The only way this country can move forward is if all stakeholders on all sides are prepared to make that painful compromise that is necessary. This is a country with significant divergence in terms of what people want. No one can get everything that they want in a country like Ethiopia, but it is important, taking the existing constitution as a starting point, to find a solution for the crisis that has been stabilizing the country. But we need to see a lot more from the government and the Prime Minister in terms of making those painful concessions, compromises. And as I said at the beginning, primary responsibility lies with the Prime Minister and his government to create the conditions for that kind of dialogue that would ultimately lead the country to a more durable, sustainable future.
Kjetil, I saw you nodding along to a lot of what Awol was saying there, so I want to ask you what your reaction is, but also I want to ask you, from your point of view, what has to happen for a national dialogue process to be a success?
Well, I think the sequencing here is important. A national dialogue process to create a durable new political configuration, so to say, of Ethiopia need to include all parties. The parties which are really challenging the Ethiopian statehood, you can say, are the TDF and OLA today, and a number of other smaller armed groups. So they start in the wrong end. The peace negotiations need to take place first, or rather a cessation of hostilities agreement need to be on the table first, and then you can start to think about an all-inclusive political dialogue process moving forward. But as of today, the government still considers TDF, OLA, and the other fighting units as terrorist organizations, which they will not negotiate with. And so in that regard, a national dialogue will be mute, so to say, or not relevant to the key issues challenging Ethiopia, which is the civil war. And again, it goes back to the constitutional framework. It goes back to the key issues of what Ethiopia is and how Ethiopia should be organized to accommodate the diversity of its people. And here is the core problem. And I think, first of all, the political context, the political environments need to be a civil environment. It cannot be an environment in war and at the same time conduct political dialogue.
Adem, in your previous answer, you touched on just how difficult things are for people in Ethiopia as a result of this conflict. So I want to ask you a little bit about the humanitarian dimension of all this. I mean, we've heard again and again over the past year just how dire the humanitarian crisis is that is unfolding in Ethiopia. From what you know about what's going on, how difficult has the situation become? Just how dire is it for civilians?
Thank you very much. A quick note to what Tronvoll said. He is right that we have to find a way, a solution to the crisis that is engulfing Ethiopia. And without finding a peaceful solution to the problems, it's very difficult to have the conditions for genuine inclusive dialogue that the country needs. At the same time, we should not think only in linear terms. So sequencing, the idea of sequencing is not necessarily very relevant. I think both can go hand in hand, but indeed the priority should be to stop to silence the guns and find and try and create the conditions for peace. That will then create the conditions for proper dialogue. In terms of the humanitarian situation, you're right. There has been essentially the country has been bleeding. We hear about, depending on who speaks, everybody emphasizes their own suffering. But what is true is that it's not just the people on the battlefields in Tigray and Amhara and Afar, but across the country are suffering the humanitarian consequences of the conflict. And so one of the central functions of the government, I think one of the responsibilities of the government, is to ensure that there is equitable access to humanitarian provisions in all these regions and across the country, to make sure that we can avoid suffering and death that is necessary, that is not necessary, and that certainly worsens the conflict and the grievance rather than helping it. And so making sure that people in Tigray have equitable access to humanitarian provisions, people in Afar, in Amhara, all of them getting that, I think should be a massive priority. And perhaps, going back to where we started, slowing down the confrontation, both from the TPLF and the federal government side, federal government stopping the aerial attacks, and also the TPLF stopping what are reported provocations on the borders. That can then create the conditions for first resolving the humanitarian problem, and then also perhaps resuming services, and that can then build the confidence towards a genuine peace process.
Kjetil, I saw you reacting a lot to what Adem was saying. Did you want to jump in?
No, I agree with many of the points raised here. It doesn't need to be a linear sequencing, but certainly when the political dialogue will start, well, maybe next week, a clear signal from the government versus the TDF and OLA in terms of cessation of hostilities agreement should be in place. I think also some of the parties who are invited by the government to take part in a national dialogue will put as a condition that this should be an all-inclusive national dialogue. And they don't want to enter a dialogue without TPLF and OLF, for instance. So it goes hand in hand. And the problem is that the government is sending out mixed signals, and which makes it difficult to trust the genuinity. At the same time, as is stressed by Adem, that this is a very high-risk play by the government. They have received fundamental criticism from pan-Ethiopianist and Amhara-based political actors in particular, that they are showing more or less treasonous acts by releasing some of these prisoners. So it is a high gamble by the Prime Minister to do what he does, but he should be even more clear in the way his office is communicating versus the civil war aspects of the situation in Ethiopia.
Awol, overall, where do things stand right now when it comes to the conflict?
Well, the conflict is still very active. Recently when the Tigrayan Defense Forces left the Amhara region and declared that they are withdrawing to the borders of Tigray, and the Ethiopian federal government announced that it will not be advancing the Tigray regional state, we thought that that would create an ample opportunity for diplomatic actions to be strengthened and for the parties to come to a negotiating table. But we began to see that there is a small-scale armed confrontation around the border, and of course these drone attacks and aerial bombardments. That's created really a very toxic environment for any meaningful dialogue to commence. I just want to comment on the points both Adem and Kjetil raised in terms of the need for sequencing of events. Of course, things don't have to be necessarily linear, but it's important that we have a careful sequencing of these events. The reason I say this is because if the starting point of a major political process such as a national dialogue is exclusionary, if it begins by excluding, if it commences by excluding certain key political actors, that means those political actors do not have the opportunity to participate in terms of setting the rules for the national dialogue process. So when you create, for example, a commission for a national dialogue, and when that commission is structured in certain ways where its independence would become questionable because it depends, for example, on the government and the ruling party for its budget, that creates a significant problem. The process would be seen as exclusionary from the beginning. So when we have these exclusionary beginnings, we end up in a dead end that complicates the process. So it is important that we have a careful sequencing of events. I think the political leaders that were released recently, particularly individuals within the Oromo Federalist Congress, such as Jawar Bakalis, are people with significant experience of leading peaceful resistance movements, significant support within the Oromia regional states, the largest region in the country. They would be a significant help to this process. But it is important that the government is committed to a genuine, credible, inclusive political process.
Adem, when it comes to national dialogue, is outside mediation needed?
I don't think it's necessary. And I think I want to say also that I agree with Awol that we cannot start on a bad footing. So it's very important indeed that the beginnings of the dialogue process are considered inclusive from the get-go. So the point I was trying to make was that the process is only starting. The legislation has indeed been accepted, but in terms of issues, for instance, who is going to participate in the dialogue process, and all of that will actually be decided once the commission has been set up and all. So there is enough time. So hopefully by then we will have some kind of breakthrough so that we have a clear idea of the peace process emerging and how they can then potentially that lead to the inclusion of the armed groups in the national dialogue process. But I agree that without their inclusion, it would be very, very difficult for it to succeed. In terms of the challenge, the dialogue process, the opportunities that the dialogue process creates, Awol also touched on it. There are fundamental disagreements on issues that I call are pre-democratic, but our politics has been obsessed on those issues. And finding a solution, some kind of understanding, and potentially even a consensus among a critical mass of Ethiopians on those fundamental issues will then allow us to focus on what I consider are daily democratic politics, about services, about policies, and all of that. And so I think it's very critical, and it would have to be inclusive. At the same time, I think we need to recognize, and I think all of us do now, this is a very difficult, a very complex process, and the initial steps have been taken, And so we have to encourage the government to deliver better rather than always insisting on the negative sides.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Awol, Allo, Kjetil, Tronvoll, and Adem, Kassie, Abebe. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.